This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research that's caught our attention. Our guest today is a conflict resolution expert affiliated with Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Security Studies. Gilead Sher is among the better-known negotiators in this country. He is an attorney and a veteran negotiator for Israeli-Palestinian peace. He served as chief and co-chief negotiator at the Camp David Summit in 2000 and the Taba Talks. Both of those were between 1999 and 2001. Under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and he participated in extensive rounds of covert negotiations. He served under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin as a delegate to the 1994-95 interim agreement negotiations with the Palestinians. He currently heads the Center for Applied Negotiations and is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. He is an attorney and a senior partner in Gilead Sher, Kadari & Co. law offices and many other things that we don't have time to say. Together with Dr. Anat Kurtz, also of the Institute for National Security Studies, they've co-edited a book entitled Negotiating in Times of Conflict, which is a compilation of articles written by academics and practitioners from various fields, published by the INSS in 2015. Gilead Sher, welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning, Dalia. Good morning, Gilad.
Good morning. Your book, as I said, is a compilation of articles written by both practitioners and academics, very systematic thinking and research, but it's also very practical-oriented, I would say, looking at different aspects that negotiators of violent conflict should keep in mind in order to be successful. Were you hoping this book would serve as, in a way, a toolbox or a handbook to try to really advance the practice of conflict resolution?
Yes, it certainly was one of our hopes when we assembled all these articles into one edited volume, and we thought that it could serve both practitioners and decision makers and policy makers throughout the globe, actually, because what we found out, which was inevitable in a way, was that the lessons drawn from negotiations in various areas, in various contexts and in various periods were quite universal. And there's a lot of common issues that we can draw lessons from. So basically, even someone coming from a negotiation practice in Africa and someone from Northern Europe, they find common grounds for the negotiating conflicts in other areas.
Do you think that the dynamics of our conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, have evolved over the last decade or so in a way that the insights that you offer in this book today would not have been able to be the same, say, 10 or 15 years ago?
No, I disagree with that proposition. I believe that the conflict has become maybe more complex, maybe a little bit more multidimensional. The trust is completely absent, and the parties get more and more anchored in their own incapability to overlook their own fears and concerns, etc. And the religious dimension becomes more acute in the Middle East and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. Nevertheless, the core issues, the core contentious issues are still very much the same, and the schemes, the plans that were valid a couple of decades ago are still very valid.
I want to talk about the sort of themes that arise from the book. You explain in the introduction that the articles ended up breaking down into several themes, primarily bringing in unsavory actors into negotiations, the role of international parties, and the psychological dimensions of conflict. Now, while I'd love to talk about all of them, first, I want to understand, were those the themes that you were looking for when you started to collect the articles, or did they emerge organically when you started bringing together insights from conflicts here and in other places?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is that we were not expecting necessarily those to come out and be clearly the leading factors in successful conflict resolution processes. inclusiveness, for one, is an extremely important thread throughout most of the articles in this book, bringing on board the extremists first and the moderate second is something that is completely different from the way that we approach negotiation in general. But lessons came out time after time on that point. The international intervention or the international support, the international assistance for a conflict resolution process is also, I believe, emphasized as one of the most important factors in not only the negotiation process itself, but in moderating and supervising the implementation phase afterwards. And I believe that these are at least two of the most important factors that we identified.
Okay, I really am interested in this issue of inclusivity. As you point out, many negotiations don't start like that. And I have so many questions about it. But first, let me ask you, would you say the insights about the importance of including extreme actors are confirmed by unsuccessful negotiations where they were not included and more successful negotiations when they were included?
Definitely so.
Can you give us some examples?
I believe that the successful negotiations in Northern Ireland, for instance, the intra-party negotiations, much more than the inter-party negotiations, were essential to have the former terrorists and the most, I would say, violent elements of this conflict throughout the years first consider themselves as a sort of, not game changer, but agents for change. And then when they were on board, it was like, cutting in hot butter for the rest to come on board. Because if they were capable of stating and practically doing so, decommissioning their arms and starting a new, at least a new exercise to resolve the conflict via other means, then it goes without saying that all the rest would follow. And that's what happened.
As I understand it from reading some of the articles, that really there are two phases to the negotiation. The one that you emphasize now is bringing all the parties to the table. The other one is keeping them there. Which for you is really more significant? You focus now on bringing them to the table. Once you do, it can all fall apart very easily.
Well, and so often does.
Yeah. Let me just make one distinction, because I did not mean bringing them in to sit around the table necessarily. I did emphasize the importance of addressing their concerns and making them partners in the dialogue, not necessarily around the table. It's much more often it's done indirectly and not directly.
Right, because of course there's always a problem with how do you convince each side to talk to those terrorists?
Plus, there's the question of the diaspora, which can play a kind of a double game.
Right.
Either be more extremist than the actual constituency that you can address easily.
Right. Let me point out that there's a great article in the collection by Gilead Sher specifically on that issue.
Exactly, on the Turkish-Armenian talks. Exactly. And so you cannot reach out to all of them, but you have to address all those actors that would be important at one point in time throughout the process. And if you do not address them at the earliest stage possible, you will find out that they become a huge spoiler at the very moment that you need them most.
Let's put this for a second into the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it's in some ways easier to start with other conflicts to see our own. But if that means, let's say, from the Israeli side looking towards the Palestinians, I'm assuming we would be talking about indirectly somehow including Hamas. But what about from the Palestinian side, looking at the Israeli side? Who would be those extremists or spoilers who need to somehow be represented at the talks? Is it settlers?
Yes, definitely so. I believe that the settlers and the settler community should be represented. And I believe that it is initially our task to bring them on board. The internal dialogue, in my opinion, is much more important than the external one, than the bilateral or multilateral one. First, we have to find out whether within the Israeli society and within this constituency that our leadership is referring to, we can possibly find out a common denominator that would be solid enough to raise our Degel Israel together.
Flag of Israel.
For the future of the next generations. And for this, we have to reach out to those communities and sectors that are not represented currently within the realm of any kind of dialogue and internal dialogue. Just imagine how the disengagement from Gaza could have been much more solidifying than the contrary if then had the government taken into consideration that they have to reach out to those people.
I might also add that in some cases it's not just a matter of extremists, but those who are most affected by the process. For example, I was in Kosovo at the beginning of this year, and people are talking about how the process has failed to include the Serbians who are left living in the north of Kosovo. Or likewise in the Nagorno-Karabakh negotiations, where the Karabakhis themselves are not at the table, or I should say mediations, because they're not actually negotiations. Yeah. And even if they're extremists or not extremists, they're the ones who have to live the results.
I fully agree with you, Dalia. And we had Dr. Edita Tahiri, you mentioned Kosovo. We had her at the Center for Applied Negotiations at the INSS a couple of months ago.
Just for those who don't know, she was Deputy Prime Minister and a Foreign Minister of Kosovo.
And she was the minister responsible for the negotiations. And one of the questions that was asked during that workshop that we held with her, they put her the question, how could you negotiate when there's so much violence and terrorism and extremism outside the negotiation rooms? She said, that's how you negotiate. There's no other way. If you do not negotiate, you'll never be able to stop this violence, this extremism, and these schisms that is tearing the country.
But it seems to me that your underlying assumption is that really across the board, moderates and extremists alike, the end goal is to see the conflict resolved.
Right.
And going back to, the settlers, just because it's an immediate example, they live in many ways much better with the conflict going, meaning that they can settle the land in the West Bank than with the end result of the conflict resolution, which would most probably mean their evacuation from their lands.
Well, there's a few points that I have to address about your question. First, my aim is not to resolve the conflict. My aim is to secure a Jewish democratic Israel based on the fundamental principles that are encompassed within our Declaration of Independence of 1948. The basics for the Zionist vision that became true 70 years ago, okay? So in order to do that, we have to possibly to disengage with the Palestinians and hopefully throughout a negotiated agreement. So that's the first point. The second point is that, when you look at the settlers, this is not a monolithic kind of constituency or sector, because most of the settlers, about 80% of them, already reside in areas that are adjacent to the Green Line, to the 1967 border, and they are part of the major blocks of settlements, and they will become part and parcel of Israel under any agreement, any arrangement, even a provisional boundary, okay, let alone a permanent status negotiation. So you're dealing with up to maybe 100,000 settlers that will have to be resettled in a permanent status agreement if Israel and Palestinians disengage the ones from the others. And for that, an internal dialogue is needed, because for them, the future in isolated settlements that are not part of Israel and will not become part of Israel in the future is not such a bright future.
But isn't there such a thing as too much inclusiveness? I mean, yes, the settlers are not a heterogeneous community and not monolithic. Isn't that the whole point? What if we give too much play to all the different actors, and some of them are actual spoilers? I mean, I'm thinking back about, we've just celebrated 40 years, the 40-year anniversary of the peace with Egypt, and I'm thinking about how Sadat just took it upon himself to lead this process forward with his country. If he had stopped and had a democratic process of listening to all the spoilers in Egypt at the time, it may never have happened. I mean, what about that possibility?
it all narrows down to leadership. The leadership has to decide whether, how much, when, and throughout which processes to include this or that sector, and to what extent they should have a voice around the negotiation table. I can tell you from my personal experience that throughout the negotiation process on permanent status in 1999 and 2000 and 2001, I went for, I believe, something like 10 to 12 trips to the West Bank to meet secretly with the settlers' leaders and study their concerns, sharing their plans in case they will have to be evacuated, etc., and bring the outcome of those trips onto the negotiation room. And throughout the process within the Israeli government, with the Israeli cabinet. So, there's a way to reflect opinions, ideas, standpoints, etc., in a way that does not necessarily magnify those concerns and interests.
So it's sort of knowing what their concerns are, but not necessarily giving in to every single one of them.
Exactly.
But the issue here, I think, especially coming back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not necessarily the extremists, however many there are out there, is really, if we look at our current leadership in Israel, it's right of center and generally pragmatic. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is, some people say, a reasonable man, and not necessarily very ideological or extreme in his views, yet he is the one who's perhaps most associated with adhering to the status quo. And he is the one who would not necessarily make that leap that is needed. So my question to you is perhaps, I don't know, a slightly populistic question. If you were to meet with Netanyahu tomorrow, spend an hour with him and convince him, what would you say is the first step that he should make to turn the table?
I would tell him first that, in my opinion, the status quo is untenable, that it brings about the end of the Zionist 120 years dream for a Jewish democratic nation-state in Eretz Israel, and that he has to make up his mind whether he wants the entirety of Eretz Israel or the entirety of the Jewish and Israeli people. And if this choice is made, I believe that a two-state for two people solution is required. And I will tell him the following. What I need from you as a leader is to point out that in order to secure the future of Israel as the nation-state, as a democratic nation-state of the Jewish people for generations to come, with a Jewish majority, you have to disengage from the Palestinians. So let's see how we do it. First, differentiate between the large blocks of settlements and the rest of the territory in the West Bank, and state that you have no long-term sovereignty claims on the area eastwards of, let's say, the security fence or outside the major settlement blocks. Second, start an internal dialogue with your own constituency, with the settlers, with your right-wing people, etc., and of course with the center and the left, about the future of Israel and the way we all look at this future once we have a two-state reality in place. And third, in order to secure all this, I would like to see a strategic planning, a national-scale strategic planning for the relocation of those settlers that will be singled out, or they will have to stay in the territories that will not be annexed to Israel. And then, finally, security, which is finally, but also firstly, okay, just leave the IDF there until further notice. Yes, we will be still be occupying the territory with our security forces, but we will secure our national security.
So he would say, and if I'm allowed here to speak on his behalf.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I love the way you're channeling the Prime Minister. Gilad, I'm not used to seeing you do this.
I'm groomed for stardom here. So he would say, or perhaps not explicitly, if say that he's honest for a minute, he'd say, I can have my cake and eat it too. I can have both. I can have control over the land. I mean, we've had it for 50 years and, the sky didn't fall. Israel has been a functioning democratic country so far. What is this sense of urgency? Why do you think it should be done now? He'd say, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Let me also this is exactly the question I was going to ask, but in a different way. I was going to say, what if your negotiation is not really internal Israeli dialogue and not even Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, but how do you negotiate with a leader who doesn't seem to actually have an interest in advancing peace? Is there a negotiating tactic for providing incentive or for highlighting those incentives?
Well, I think that you've got to do what the Frenchmen did, if you wish, if you want to have an example from history. They called General de Gaulle to come and stick to Algérie Française, to French Algeria. And he, after several weeks, he went there and he told whoever spoke to him, "Je vous ai compris, I understood you." They all thought that, he's going to do it. And he had 75% of the Frenchmen supporting him in continuing the colonization of 130 years of Algeria by France. But he turned 180 degrees backwards. And he went the other way, actually. And he, as a leader, took all the people from Algeria, made Algeria independent. And he had then the support of the majority of his people.
Why?
Afterwards.
What changed his mind?
Because this was a matter of leadership. And now, if you point out to your own leader that the only way to secure the basic fundamental values of Israel for the future generations, not for the next newsreel or newspaper or caption in a radio interview, whatever, is exactly that, is to secure a Jewish majority in a democratic Israel. You need to disengage from 4.5 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And you've got to disengage and create a reality of two states for two people and conserve or preserve the conditions for a full-fledged agreement eventually one day when it comes. But that's your responsibility as my leader, my Zionist leader, elected, democratically elected.
I want to get back to some of the technicalities of how a negotiation can be successful. There's a very interesting chapter by Miriam Fendias-Elman. It's on spoilers, not exactly the same as extremists, and I call them peace haters. But, the thinking in that chapter is how do we develop strategies to inoculate against their influence? And the chapter reviews its very interesting comparison with the negotiations between Russia and Chechnya in the late 90s and the Oslo Accords. And it brought me back to an insight that I think I'd like to get your input on, which is that these were all long-term interim accords, and they did not determine final status. And I think that in those situations, the spoilers say, there's this dead time while we're waiting for the final status. We can still change the final status if we try hard enough, usually through violence. Have we learned from these two separate and ultimately unsuccessful processes that maybe this is not the great model for negotiations, but that interim periods should be shortened? Maybe we should even start with final status on the theory that if there's a will, there's always a way to implement it, but we know the vision we're heading towards. And then spoilers will say, we can't change things by blowing up a bus.
Well, ideally, what you offer here, of course, is good. But with the lack of trust, with a complete lack of confidence between the leaders, and with the very weak leadership that we see leading towards any kind of dialogue or process for leading to peace, or at least to an underlying process that leads towards a final status. I can't understand those who advocate final status now, because it's impossible in the foreseeable future to reach a resolution of all the core issues that are so intertwined and so problematic from so many dimensions. I do agree with my good friend, Professor Miriam Elman from Syracuse, that spoilers should be addressed immediately when they react, when they act, whatever. We have to immediately kill those violent trends and not allow them to continue in a way that is most of the time, I would say, even exponential, because spoilers tend to become much harder spoilers when there are transition periods and interim periods. However, at this point in time, a gradual process is needed, because the trend that we are experiencing in the last decade or so is a slow deterioration towards a one binational state, which would be a disaster for the Zionist vision and for the Palestinians as well, which will bring about neither a Jewish state nor a democratic one, because it's impossible. So the way to tackle this problem is to gradually, step by step, reverse this trend into flattening the slope towards at least a livable reality of two states.
But so much of the lack of trust seems to actually have at its core, we don't trust that the other side has the same final status goal. And again, look at another conflict. Serbia and Kosovo technical dialogues again. All you hear is the Kosovars saying, well, the Serbians, all they really want to do with this long-term unending dialogue process is undermine our sovereignty. And the Serbians say all the Kosovars really want to do is completely take over the north. Maybe if there was a final status, there could be a long-term implementation phase, but everybody would know which side they're going towards, and that would erode this massive lack of trust about what the end goal should be.
In my opinion, it's impractical to start looking at what Oslo hoped for 25 years ago. Let's first become very clear about the end game. And the architecture of Oslo actually talked about an interim period, but a very short one, like 3 to 5 years. Okay, now we are in second year of this?
24,
yes,
yeah.
Okay, so of the interim agreement. So I believe that we have to change the formula that we used while negotiating permanent status, which was nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And what we have to put as a new formula now and apply it is whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated should be implemented. And by that, in a transitional manner, with phased agreement and partial agreements and interim agreements on the way, layer over layer, build a solid ground to walk towards permanent status eventually.
I would like to ask another question because a colleague of ours and a friend is one of the co-authors of an article that's Dr. Ruthie Pliskin co-authored an article in
the psychological,
book. About the psychological dimensions. And I wanted to ask you, I know we have not so much time left, but can you summarize why so much space in the book is devoted to these socio-psychological dimensions? I know I don't really have to ask as a public opinion researcher in my spare time, but I'd like to hear your input.
Because this is considered the psychological effect and even the cultural or the intercultural dimensions of a conflict are often somewhat neglected in a way that they are considered, the soft attributes of a conflict, while in my opinion and in these authors' opinion, this might become the most problematic spoiler, both throughout the negotiation, but even more so in the implementation phase. And if you do not address it as early as possible, address the fears, address the concerns, address the fear from the other side, address the fear from the change in your own side, then you're doomed to fail in implementing whatever the outcome of a negotiation process brings up.
Right, Gilead Sher.
He is the co-editor of Negotiating in Times of Conflict. Thank you for being here. We also want to point out that you were the author of a newer book called The Battle for Home, which came out last year in Hebrew and maybe soon to be in English.
Makavalabait, yes.
Makavalabait. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Rumey Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can help us survive if you want to know how. Just write to us, Gilad, G-I-L-A-D, at tlv1.fm, and we'll tell you how. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. There are almost 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and annoyed.
Hopefully annoyed.
Hopefully annoyed, of course. Provoked as well. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast. Ideas from Israel, and follow us, me and Dalia, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.